You're smarter than a C-stick. You'll always be my first pick.
Okay, so a lot of you guys sent me some pretty cool techniques, and in fact, none of them were the same as what I usually do, but because so many of you sent me a pretty standardized method of doing this, I'm gonna use that one. So let's say we've got I to the 30th, and we wanna figure out what that is. Now, we could write out all the I's and pair them up like we're folding socks, but there is a much easier way. This is why there's a much easier way. If you notice by watching a video, which some of you did, I repeats itself. It has a pattern. So for example, I to the first power is just I. That's pretty straightforward. I squared, we said, magically transforms into -1. Okay, that's pretty simple. I cubed is both of these together, so you have a -1 and an I, so it'd be -I. I to the 4th power is 2 of these, so it's -1 times -1, which equals 1. Now, once you go I to the 5th, it goes back to this one. I to the 6th goes to this one. I to the 7th goes to this one. And so there's a pattern. Every 4 I's, this pattern repeats. So if you can remember what I to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th are, then you know what I to any power is. And this is how you do it. Basically, you take your number, so up here we've got I to the 30th, and we divide it by 4. Now, if you were to divide this by 4, so 30 divided by 4, and this is kind of a weird one because you're going to get that it goes in 7 times, and I'm going to take you old school on this. So 7 times, and 7 times would be 28. There would be 2 left over. So I'm going to write this little weird remainder of 2. So 7 times with a remainder of 2, right? Now, this 7 doesn't really matter. I don't even need that. All I need is the remainder, because basically, if you have the remainder, you look down here, this whole thing is just going to equal whatever the remainder is. So this one, I to the 30th power, is just going to equal a -1. All right, let me do that again because I know that was a little confusing. Okay, so let's try. I to the, let's do something crazy, 25th. Okay, let's divide 25 by 4. How many times does 4 go into 25? Well, I'm going to say that it goes in 6 times because 6 times 4 equals 24. So if I divide 25 by 4, I'm going to get 6 and then a decimal. Well, really I want that decimal as a remainder. So if I do 6 times 4, I get 24. How many is left over? Well, 25 minus 24 is 1 left over. My remainder is 1. I don't necessarily need all the other things. I just need the remainder. So I go back up here and I say, okay, here's my remainder. And your remainder is always going to be 1, 2, or 3. If there is no remainder, then you're going to use this one right here. So for example, this one has a remainder of 1, so this whole thing, I to the 25th, just equals I. Pretty cool. Now, you can do that with I to any power. If you have I to the 600ths, I to the 2,537th, you can divide it by 4 and then see how many you have. So let's do a really beastly one. So here's a monster right here. Let's do I to the 404th power. Okay, so first step is I'm going to divide this by 4. So on a calculator, I would do something like this. Type 404 divided by 4. Now, the weird part is this. You're not going to come out with a decimal. You're going to come out with just a perfect whole number because this is going to come out to be 101. So there is no remainder on this one. If there is no remainder, we use that last one which is I to the fourth, which just equals 1. So this whole thing just equals 1 because there is no remainder. So we use the last one, the I to the fourth. Now, let's do a beastly one where there is a remainder. Okay, so let's walk this one through step by step. So I'm going to do I to the 370th. Now, my first step on the calculator, I'm going to do 370 divided by 4. Now, when you do this on a calculator, it's probably not going to give you any kind of remainder. It's going to give you a decimal format. So I am going to get, when I do this, 92.5. So I know that 4 goes into this 92 whole times. So kind of the easiest way to do this would be, okay, well, what is that? 92 times 4 equals 368. Okay, well, what am I left over with then? And you can think of it two ways. You can think of, well, I'm left over with half of 4, or you can just do 370 minus 368. And I know I'm left over with 2, or a remainder of 2. So then I go back and I look, okay, I have a remainder of 2, so that means there's a 2 up here. Well, what is I squared? As long as you remembered those original I to the first, second, third, and fourth, you're good. You know that I squared is -1. So this whole thing, I don't have to sit there and write out 370 socks. I can just say, okay, the whole thing equals -1. And I've got my answer. And some of you guys sent me this technique. It's a really good and common technique. I love it. Good job. You got some extra credit on the quiz itself. Otherwise, that's how you can do I in the power. If you have any questions about that, email me.
You're slicker than a D-pad. You're almost smart as Mr. Rad.
Okay, everyone, so I wanted to talk to you a tiny bit about some square roots, but mixing in the imaginary numbers. So let me just do some square roots without imaginary numbers first. So let's say that we have something like the square root of, let's do it real simple. Let's do 25. So if I do the square root of 25, most everybody in their head real quick, they know that, oh, okay, if I can do the square root perfectly, this would just be 5. I can just put the 5 right there and I'm done. But let's say that we have something like this, the square root of, let's do 75. Now, most people in their head would not just be like, yes, I know the answer to that. So what you would do is you could say, okay, 75 is actually 3 times 25. And then you could say, okay, I know how to take the square root of 25. And so the square root of 25 is 5. So you can bring the 5 outside. And then you've got this little 3 left over. So you can do it like that, which is kind of cool. Now, this is the tricky part of something that we've never done before, because we had stated previously that I equals the square root of -1. So if we combine things under a square root and we have a negative under there, so let's say, let me use a different color just to illustrate this. Let's say that we have the square root of -25. Now, before we even mess with the numbers, I want to look at this negative because this thing is really important. Before, we would look at that and we'd say, oh, we can't do it. But now, we can do it. In fact, the square root of a -1, we know what it is. It's I. So this actually equals the square root of -1 times 25. And in fact, we can do both of these. So we can do the square root of -1, which is I, and we can do the square root of 25, which is 5. And I'm just going to put the normal number in front. So we've got 5i. So the square root of -25 becomes 5i. Now, let me teach you a little bit more of a simplistic method of doing this. If you ever see a negative under a square root, and you've got your numbers combined. So by that I mean you don't have something like -5 plus 2 plus 7 where the numbers are not combined, but instead you have the square root of everything's combined, and let's say you have -13 under here like this. Now, square root of 13, we're not going to do anything with that because it would become a hideous decimal, but there is one thing that we can do, because we can always pop that I out. So this is really like the square root of -1 times 13. And so we know what the square root of -1 is. It's an I. Now, we can't do anything with the square root of 13, so we can just leave that in there, but we can always pop the I out if we see a negative. That's, in fact, our first step. So let me show you a real-life illustration of what you're going to do when you see a negative under the square root. Now, this is going to hurt a little, but remember, math hurts a little. So for the sake of loving you guys and teaching you math, I'm going to show you always, when you get a square root with a negative and then a number, do this first. Always. Always pop your eye out first. I hope that helped.